Is there actual evidence for
Yeah.
Jesus, or is this person just a myth? Did he walk on the earth? Did he live on the earth? Or is he just a fictional character?
How do historians verify historical evidence? What metrics and standards do they use? And we're going to apply those very same metrics to Jesus of Nazareth.
So it's important for us when we are studying ancient times to really go back in time and see what was the technology like in that period. We know that there's such a thing as language evolution. We know that culture changes over time.
Sources matter.
But we see that a lot of people think that the Bible is just a good book that was written by a bunch of people to keep, certain people conditioned to a certain way of thinking.
There are so many lies on the internet.
And because we are in this age where there's so much information around, we think that the existence of an information automatically authenticates it.
You know that your KJV Bible, it's William Shakespeare that wrote it.
Show me a picture of Jesus and I would believe you.
I want to see a photograph. I want to see a medical record, a court record that Jesus existed. We've had several forgeries, like the Gospel of Jesus' wife. Since we don't investigate fingerprints, photos, videos, what then are we looking at?
In terms of looking at ancient sources for historical figures, we're looking at things like
welcome to Reveal Jesus TV, where we talk about the historicity of Jesus, the historical evidence and historical case for Jesus, where we give you reasonable evidence for the life of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, his life, his death, and his resurrection.
my name is Love Afeni,
and I am Afeni Precious,
and we will be your host for this podcast. When we speak about the Bible, or when we look at general perspective towards the Bible, we see that a lot of people think that the Bible is just, a good book that was written by a bunch of people to keep, certain people conditioned to a certain way of thinking or a certain way of life. And when we talk about Jesus, a lot of people just think that is a fictional character in that book. So today we will be taking a deep dive into the evidence for Jesus. Now, when we talk about the Bible, there are a number of ways or a number of lenses we could look at the Bible through. We could look at the Bible from a theological perspective. We could look at the Bible from a philosophical perspective. We could look at the Bible from a sociological perspective, and we could look at the Bible from the historical perspective. So in this episode of the podcast, we'll be looking at the Bible from the historical perspective, focusing on the person of Jesus. And the questions would be, is there actual evidence for Jesus, or is this person just a myth? Is he a real person? Did he walk on the earth? Did he live on the earth? Or is he just a fictional character?
Yes. I remember we were coming from an inspection one day and we were listening to the radio and the host was literally saying that that your KJV Bible, it's William Shakespeare that wrote it. And the person could not even respond. He said it about 3 times.
Confidently. With so much confidence.
Yes.
You would be convinced if you didn't know better.
Yes.
And that is why it's so important for believers to understand the historicity of the Bible.
Yes.
And even if you are not a believer, it's important for you to understand what is the implication of this book. The people who believe in what this book believe that this person is the savior of the world, and anybody who believes him will be saved, and those who do not believe will be condemned to eternal damnation. And if any book at all is making a claim like that, it's worth investigating.
Yeah. And also when it comes to historical evidence, people just say, oh, I saw this on the internet and it made me, question my faith in Jesus. I listened to so and so podcasts. There are so many lies on the internet. So you want to look at the experts. Sources matter. We're going to look at how do historians verify historical evidence. What metrics and standards do they use? What do they look out for? And then we're going to apply those very same metrics to Jesus of Nazareth. We're also going to compare other ancient figures and historical figures that lived in the 1st century. We're talking about 2,000 years ago, 4th century, and we're also going to compare with Jesus as well.
Because Jesus, is a figure that existed in the ancient world. And, a lot of historians attribute 476 AD to the end of the ancient world. And that signified the end of the Roman Empire. So we're looking at historical figures that existed before then, the historical evidence for them, and Jesus happened to be one of the historical figures that actually existed within that time period.
People saying, I want to see medical records, I want to see a photograph, I want to see a medical record, a court record that Jesus existed. So how do we look at that?
I think it's very important for us to really, when we are, looking at a certain time period, it's important for us to understand what was in that time period. We know that there's such a thing as technological advancement. We know that there's such a thing as language evolution. We know that culture changes over time. So it's important for us when we are studying ancient times to really go back in time and see what was the social economic environment like in that period. What was the technology like in that period? What did people do in that period? What was the culture in that period, in that particular place? So it's important for us to understand that we may not always be able to apply the context of what is today. Like, a picture, some people. So I saw a video and this guy was saying, show me a picture of Jesus and I would believe you. So we need to understand that camera had not even been invented in the time of Jesus. Camera had not even been invented 200 years
medieval
ago.
age.
So if anybody comes and says this is a picture of Jesus, it's obviously a lie. Because that technology wasn't available then.
Exactly.
So what we're going to be doing is looking at what was available then and verifying based off of what was available then.
Yes. Since we don't investigate fingerprints, we don't investigate through photos, videos, what then are we looking at?
In terms of looking at ancient sources for historical figures, we're looking at things like manuscripts. There's always been writing, and writing is basically, just like we know it today, the process of putting down an information on I wouldn't really say document, but putting down a piece of information for the purpose of preservation of that thought or for the purpose of passing it down. So initially in the ancient world, you'd see inscriptions on tablets. Just like
epigraphy,
exactly, epigraphy, just like Moses, the inscription on tablets. And later on, it moved from inscription on tablets to writing on, we'll call it maybe document of those terms, but basically they were more like papyrus sheets or, animal skin. And we moved from that to now we have whole books. So when we are looking in the ancient world, we're looking at inscriptions on tablets, we're looking at, old manuscripts.
Yes, we're looking at the historiography, which is the study of the ancient texts and written records, epigraphy, the art, the language, and the inscriptions. Then we're looking at archaeology, which is like the study of the remains. Ancient history brought about these other studies from historiography to epigraphy to archaeology. How do we now verify evidence from the very first century? We start with authenticity. So we've said that we are looking at manuscripts, written documents, and we can also find geographical references or archaeological references to corroborate what was written. We check for the authenticity of these documents first. Like I said in the beginning, the issue with many people that throw things online on TikTok is that their sources are incorrect. So they throw so many lies because there are many forged ancient documents. So one of the very things that people that study historiography check for is the authenticity, that this is not a forgery. So if I show you a manuscript and you tell me, I found this when I was digging in Egypt, we carbon date not just the ancient document, we also carbon date the ink. We've had several forgeries, like the Gospel of Jesus' wife. There are many known
forgeries.
Unargued forgeries. So sources matter.
And I think it's very important to, really emphasize on this because we're in a time when you could just go online and find anything online. And because we are in this age where there's so much information around, we think that the existence of an information or a piece of information automatically authenticates it. And it's important for us to really balance and understand that something exists does not mean it's true. I could say the sky is red. Information, is that accurate? No. The same way you could find a manuscript that says, oh, Jesus had 3 daughters and one was African, the other was European, the other was Indian. Existence of information does not automatically translate to authenticity. Hence why this verification process, thorough, detailed verification process is so important.
And that's why you don't just Google it. We're in this information age where somebody told me I found something on Google. It just tells me like you didn't do much research. You
TikTok
don't just,
university student.
Yes, you don't just Google it because I can put anything on Google. If my SEO is right, my search engine
is going to be at the very top
Exactly.
of the search engine doesn't mean it's correct.
Yes. A lot of process goes into verifying ancient documents. Is it a
Yes.
credible source? And then we look at language and vocabulary consistency. Is this language in the text consistent with the culture of that time?
And I think that's so important. It's like, you find an ancient document buried somewhere, maybe in Ogun State, for example, and you're saying, oh yeah, we can really trace this document to the history of Ogun State. We are seeing Portuguese written on the documents. Example of a forgery. Why? Because it wasn't consistent with the language there at that time. So it's important to understand cultural context. So what historians do is that they really go deep to validate that this is the known culture around this region within this time. If this document in any way contrasts that, then it's most likely a forgery, probably written in another place in an entirely different time, or even in the same place but in a different time.
Then we also look at corroboration. Do we have multiple attestation or multiple sources? When we mean sources, we mean people writing this information. Do we have direct eyewitnesses? Do we have primary eyewitness account? How close? What's the proximity of this eyewitness account to the source?
To the time when this person existed.
To the time when this person existed. What's the proximity to the source? Do we have multiple attestations? Do we have hostile sources? Do we have neutral sources writing about this person? Do we have related sources? Do we even have unrelated sources?
So what are hostile sources?
Hostile sources are people that really don't care about the person that
in
question. They really don't care. In fact, they are hostile, probably even persecuting. So the more sources we have, the better, because you can see that there are less likely chances of errors when you have multiple sources to compare from.
So it's just like, when I studied physics in school, and one of the things we do is research. A lot of us did final year research. You find that when you are doing a survey across a certain area, the more data points you have, the higher the likelihood of accuracy. So the same way, the more sources you have speaking or confirming the same information, the more likely it is to be true.
Yes, and then we look at credibility as well. We look at internal consistency. This document, are they consistent, or are there contradictions in the core message? Are there internal consistencies of the very core message? The witnesses in question, do they have the ability to actually write, even if they can? We also look at embarrassing details, or what we call criterion of embarrassment.
For criterion of embarrassment, we find that in a lot of myths, the subjects or the heroes in the myths are generally tried to be painted perfect. So the question is, if we have a text written about a certain person, a lot of historians, if they are able to find, embarrassing facts within that text about that person, they believe it's more likely to be truthful and accurate, because it means that the writers are not trying to paint a certain image of perfection, but are just trying to write the reality of what it is. For example, we look at, the book of Kings, and you see the fact that it is known that David took someone else's wife, sent the man to the battlefield, had him killed in the front line, and married his wife. That is an embarrassing fact. But it wasn't hidden. It was still kept within the text, meaning that the writers of those texts were just concerned about passing down the message, whether it's embarrassing or it's not embarrassing. For example, a Jesus in the temple got angry. A holy person who claims to be God righteous got angry and started throwing traders out of the temple. An embarrassing factor, but it wasn't excluded from the text. And a lot of historians will say it's because these people were not trying to just create or pass down a certain perspective or image of the person. They were just trying to write down the truth of the person that they interacted with.
Some historians say that the crucifixion itself is an embarrassing detail, because you wouldn't want your hero to go through such mockery, such shame, such bully, humiliation. The way the disciples, they had embarrassing details about themselves, and even the witness of women being the very first to view the tomb. If the disciples were trying to fabricate stories, they would use male witnesses. In the very first century, female witnesses were legally and culturally devalued. So if the disciples were trying to fabricate a story, they would use male witnesses, that if men were the first to see the empty tomb of Jesus. And it's an embarrassing detail in ancient history.
Yeah, and I think it's sometimes this may be very difficult for the modern day people, or for people today to understand the fact that in the ancient world, the testimony of women did not count in court.
Yeah.
So you're not going to find a lot of writings about women. You're not going to find a lot of, heroic deeds
Yeah.
done by women
Yeah.
mentioned in ancient history.
Yeah.
And that's because women were generally, their testimony was incredible.
Yeah.
So the fact that the disciples wrote that, they were not even the first to see Jesus, that and to see that the tomb was empty. It was the woman. That's why,
Yes.
historians consider it an
Highly
embarrassing
probable.
factor.
Yeah, and highly probable. And also, we now look at archaeological and geographical confirmation of the places, the people, the rulers, the events within that time period.
And I think this is so important because, when I hear people say things like, Jesus or the Bible was just, it's a fictional book, we find that there are places that were mentioned in the Bible in that time, 2000 years ago, that have been proven today to be what they were in the time of the disciples. So for example, the pool of Bethsaida.
It was thoroughly described in John 5 as having 5 porches. And after an excavation, they actually found it to be exactly as John described. And even the pool of Siloam, that pool where Jesus told the man born blind to actually, wash his eye. I mean, there are many multiple archaeological and geographical attestations. They just help to corroborate that the disciples actually interacted with real people, real rulers, real places that existed in those times.
Even Pontius
Yes.
Pilate. So in the book of Luke, you see Luke say Pontius Pilate was a governor. Tacitus wrote that he was a procurator. So a lot of, historians and a lot of atheists then said, oh, there was an error in the book of Luke because of that information. But years later, it was found a tombstone with inscriptions that translated to Governor Pontius Pilate, further proving the historicity of the Bible, of the New Testament writings, that these things were not fabricated, but they actually align with historical, political truths in those times.
Yes. And even the pool of Bethsaida was for many years seen as a fiction. People thought that was it. The way the Bible described it in John 5 as, people will wait once in a year to have a bath there. Yeah. People said it was a fiction until they later found it. Archaeology is not field proof. It only proves that people existed and they interacted with real places, real people. Because I can see a coin with love's face on it. It doesn't mean that love is kind, God-fearing, a child of God and all that. It just means that love exists. So archaeology within that time period. So archaeology itself does not prove text viability, but
it just proves
it helps to, it helps us to build confidence that what we wrote is actually what existed within that time period.
Next on this episode, we'll be looking at popular ancient history figures and their historical evidences. So we have some very popular people we know from the ancient world: Alexander the Great, King Herod, and many others. Socrates,
Plato,
and Plato, all of these people from ancient history. We were taught in schools that these were guaranteed people that existed in the ancient world, uncontested, undebated. And now we're going to be giving you their historical evidences, after which we'll go to Jesus and give you the historical evidence for Jesus. How was Alexander the Great confirmed to be a real person that existed?
Yes. So Alexander the Great lived around 356 to about 323 BC. We have the earliest writing written 400 years after he had died, written by Arrian and Plutarch. 400 years after he had died.
4 centuries.
400 years later. And the earliest surviving manuscripts that we can see, we can touch and interact with, about 1,200 years later. We also have Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, actually, most of what we have, I don't know, I always find this funny. Most of what we have for Julius Caesar, he wrote himself. Julius Caesar wrote most of his works. And then we have others writing about him about 150 to 160 years later. And earliest surviving manuscripts that we can see, touch, and interact with came in about 900 years later. For Pontius Pilate and for Herod, we have the archaeological evidence, the inscriptions, right, for Pontius Pilate, but we don't have any biography about Pontius Pilate. We don't have any biography about Herod. What we have is what people like Tacitus, Josephus, a Jewish historian, Luke, when they reference them. Those are the little references we have here and there, but we don't argue that they existed. Socrates did not write anything about himself. I mean, Plato is father of philosophy, Socrates, Aristotle. These are fathers of philosophy. Most of what we have written about Socrates was written by Plato, his students. And even Tiberius, who reigned during the time of Pontius Pilate, during the time of Jesus' crucifixion as well. We have 4 of his biographies, Suetonius and others. And then the earliest surviving manuscript of Plato comes in 1,200 years after.
Yeah.
So the closer the source is to the person in question,
to the time when the person in question lived,
the closer the surviving manuscript, or the closer it was written, the more confidence we have in knowing that what we have is what the authors wrote, that it wasn't exaggerated, that things were not added or removed from the text.
Exactly. For example, a better person to write about the life of your grandmother would probably be, their children, your parents, and they would be a better source than you or than their great grandchildren. And this is still a gross under exaggeration. Why? Because this is just a period of decades. Now multiply that by 10 and convert that to centuries. So yeah.
And also, if we talk about number of manuscripts, for Plato, we have about 200 manuscripts. For Tacitus, we have 20. Tacitus is one of the sources we have that wrote about the life of Jesus. We have less evidence for even this historian than we have for Jesus himself. The historian we use as a source for the life of Jesus and people like Herod, Tiberius, we have very few manuscripts of his own existence. Okay, so we have 20 manuscripts for Tacitus. We have 10 to 20 for Julius Caesar. For Josephus, he has better preserved manuscripts. We have about 100 to 300.
Next up, we would be going into the historical evidence for the life of Jesus. What are the documents that we have?
So we can look at the historical evidence for Jesus in several ways because we have many sources. We have Christian sources. We have hostile sources. So when we talk about Christian sources, first of all, when we as Christians look at the Bible, because I know we're talking to different groups with different audiences. The Bible is made up of 66 books written over a period of 1,600 years by 40 authors. But you have it as a book today. Each of these 66 books were separate books, separate scrolls. You see that? So when we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we see them as the 4 Gospels, but historians see that as the biographies of Jesus. So those are historical documents. When you read Paul, you see the epistles. We call them Paul's letters. They are separate, independent sources. Do you see that? And then we have some hymns, what we call them creeds, that are in the New Testament. They are called creeds. They are also independent sources, okay? But they are part of Christian sources. So we have creeds. Creeds are like hymns, sayings, declarations that the church will usually say, like the way we say the grace of God. I think that's
the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, the sweet fellowship of the Holy Spirit. That's an example of a creed.
They are powerful declarations. Some of them have this, they are poetic, they have poetry lines. An example of a creed is 1 Corinthians 15. Another example is Romans 1:3-4. We also have Philippians 2:6-11. It's called Christ's hymn. Philippians 2:6-7. 1 Corinthians 15:3-7 is the earliest creed. And we date this to months to 2 to 5 years after the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
That is so early.
That is early.
Because we're looking at this in contrast to manuscripts 400 years after these people lived.
Yes.
So finding manuscripts that date back to as early as 1 to 2 years or a few months after the crucifixion of Jesus is just historically powerful. Phenomenal. It speaks volumes about the authenticity of this document.
And it's also important to know that till today, we still have some of these surviving manuscripts, papyrus from the book of John, that date back to 100 to 150 AD that still exists today.
And I think it's so important to mention that because a lot of people think that the Bible has just been translated and then the translation translated and then that translation translated and then it's like a whole chain of translation leading to a lot of meaning and a lot of content being lost across translations. But I think it's important for you to know that we have earlier surviving manuscripts that date back to as early as 100 years after this. So you could just go and see this document. There are pictures of them online, and I think we'll put some of these pictures on there. So when it comes to how our Bible translations got in, they are not translated from, copies of copies of copies of copies. Like, for example, a lot of people think that the NLT, NIV, and newer translations were translated from the KJV translation.
Oh God.
So they would say things like, I'm the one reading the original Bible because I read
Yeah.
KJV only.
Yes.
No, when a new translation is about to come out, they go back to the original Greek and Hebrew
manuscript
text.
Yes.
And they translate from there, but they do so even with other translations just to make sure that they are on the right track. So you can be sure that what you have in your modern Bible today is what we had in the very earliest copies of those scrolls.
Yes. I want to touch on the telephone game that you mentioned, because a lot of skeptics use it. It's a faulty way to compare the way the New Testament was transmitted.
Yeah.
Telephone game is whispered. The oral tradition of the way that Jesus taught was taught publicly, was not whispering to people's ears.
Sermon on the Mount.
My goodness.
Thousands of people.
Yes.
In a loud voice.
So the telephone game comparison is so flawed. It's like I'm whispering. If I whisper and I say, let me use a word, and I say thoughtfulness to love, and love says it to another person. By the end, we might have a word like tortoise. In the telephone game, you whisper, and the goal and purpose and the fun of telephone game is to have the end goal distorted. The goal of the transmission and the oral tradition of teaching is to have the Bible preserved.
The original text.
Preserved. When he sent the disciples to go to teach as well, they themselves were teaching, reiterating the popular teachings of Jesus. So they also knew in fact, people knew the popular teachings of Jesus. So if you even made a mistake, you could say, excuse me, he did not say that. He said this.
Yes.
Do you see that? The goal is not to
conceal information.
Thank you so much. It's not to conceal an information. It's to give clarity. So please, let's stop using the telephone game as an example. It's flawed on so many levels.
It's not a copy of a copy of a copy, because we have some of the earliest original copies.
And one of the greatest things is the fact that because we have so many, it's so easy to detect if there is an error. When you have your Bible, you have something called footnotes. At the bottom of your footnotes, you see them telling you, the Hebrew phrase here means this. The Bible is a very transparent book. We are not trying to hide information from you. Do you see that? And the way the Bible was also transmitted, it was not controlled. The Bible was transmitted across several continents, that if there was at any point an error or a mistake,
there's another document elsewhere that would prove that there's an error. Do you see that?
The goal was not to conceal information, it was to reveal information. The goal was not to have a narrative control. We have some documents that the essence is to control. The Bible's goal was to translate so that every human being in the world can understand what it says. You can read it for yourself.
And we have over 5,000 manuscripts.
5,800 Greek manuscripts.
You understand? That have been dated across different times.
Yes.
And their information are not contradictory.
Yes.
So it's like you have data points from different times.
Yes.
And they are not saying anything contradictory, which further proves the authenticity of this document.
And then we have about 20,000 plus other manuscripts. So if there is an error in anyone,
it's going to be so easy to detect.
And obvious to. It's like you are doing a jigsaw puzzle and you have more pieces than you need.
Let's just say we have 100,000 piece puzzle, but you have 100,100 pieces. It's easier to piece together because you have more. You can just remove the ones that you find do not fit.
That's even an under-exaggeration. It's an understatement, because for the Bible we have much more manuscripts than needed. And it's also that if everybody in the world, if we lose our Bible and our biblical translations, we can get our Bible again. We can be very sure that what we have here is what the authors wrote. And that's going to be what we're going to discuss extensively in the next episode. But let's go on to the early creed. So let's look at what 1 Corinthians 15 says. 1 Corinthians was written by Apostle Paul, but this is a pre-Pauline creed. Do you see that? Because Paul highlighted that he was given to him. This is something the church will gather together and say. Paul was hostile to Christians, and then he had a radical conversion, and he changed radically. He even gave his life. He died for his faith. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, it says, Christ died for our sin according to the scripture, was buried, I'm just going straight, was buried, rose on the third day, appeared to 500, including Cephas and the other disciples, James, and by the other apostles. You see that? We also have Philippians 2:6-11. We have Romans 1, 3 to 4
Philippians 2, 6
to
to
11.
11.
This is a
And
Christ
it
hymn.
says, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bond servant, and coming in the likeness of men, and being found in the appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Therefore, God also has highly exalted him and given him the name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow, of those in heaven and of those on earth and of those under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father.
Then we have Paul letters dated AD 48. Paul's letters came first. And that's very funny because when you look at the letters of Paul, you could see that the church was already established. They had meetings. Our core doctrine of the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus, the worship of Jesus as God was already established. Next, we have Mark, and then we have Luke, Matthew, and John. And then we have manuscripts from the apostolic fathers, like the direct disciple of John, Apostle John. And then we have neutral and hostile sources. So we have Roman historian Tacitus, we have Jewish historian Josephus, we have Pliny the Younger. He was like a Roman lawyer. He used to persecute Christians.
When you see hostile sources like this, and they are making reference to the person of Jesus within the time that, the letters of the apostles claimed that he existed, it just goes on to say that this person wasn't made up. Because if it was a made up figure, someone who hated him wouldn't be writing about him.
Yeah, exactly. Let's read out the statements. We have Tacitus, Annals 1544. Christos, from whom the name Christians had its origin. So from this document alone, you can see that it mentions Christ and it mentions Christians. That this person Christ, that's where we got the name Christians from. Christos, from whom the name Christians had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. This corroborates what Luke clearly, articulately documented. And let's read the first chapter in the book of Luke to see that Luke was he carefully wrote a journalistic account of the gospel. What you have in the book of Luke is it's an amazing journalistic account. It made references to so many things that we find historically and geographically credible.
So Luke chapter 1, I would read.
Yeah.
It says, many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us.
Yeah.
They use the eyewitness reports circulated among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I've also decided to write an accurate account for you, most honorable Theophilus,
Yeah.
so you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught. So this shows that the book of Luke is not just a theological book. Luke was it was an investigative journalist.
Yes.
So this was his report.
You can see that he's not one of the disciples. Luke was one of the travel companions of Apostle Paul. He also wrote the book of Acts. One of the Gospels, you'll be wondering, who is Mark? Mark, his full name, John Mark.
Mark was a disciple of Peter and also a travel companion of Apostle Paul. He traveled with Paul and Barnabas for a while.
And we know that John himself was a direct disciple, was a direct eyewitness, primary source for Jesus. And Matthew was a disciple of Jesus himself.
Next up on the hostile and neutral
sources, we have Josephus, a Jewish historian. He didn't really care much for Christians. There was a political and religious tension in that time, in the time of Jesus. So what Josephus said, James, the brother of Jesus, who is called the Christ. So he corroborated the fact that James was a brother to Jesus. Okay. And then in Testimonium Flavianum, he said, at this time, there was a wise man called Jesus. He was the Christ. He appeared to them alive again on the third day. That Pilate condemned him to the cross. The Jewish historian mentioned Jesus' existence, that Jesus was condemned under Pontius Pilate, that Jesus was called the Christ. We are going with what is widely acceptable as what Josephus wrote. And then we have Pliny the Younger. He was known as a Roman lawyer, and he worked under the rule of Emperor Trajan. And so he described Christian worship of Jesus as God, because he persecuted lots of Christians, so many of them. And in the process of persecuting, he would question them. And in a letter he wrote to Emperor, he wrote that they were in the habit of meeting on a fixed day before dawn and singing a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery. This is from a direct questioning and persecution of Christians at that time.
And this is so powerful, and it also speaks to, some people who believe that, yes, Jesus was a historical figure, or believe that the early Christians did not worship Jesus as God. This is a hostile source affirming that, yes, early Christians did sing to Jesus as God, which is so powerful.
Yes. And it's also very powerful because this is not a later invention. This is
having
an hostile source
who found this out,
while
not by questioning, but by torture.
By questioning and
you don't
torture.
lie when you're being tortured.
It's a lot. Lucian of Samosata. The Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. And then it was impressed on them by the original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. So it has a mocking tone that the Christians worshipped a crucified man.
Further testifying to the claims of Christianity that these were not just made up. They were known to even people who did not believe, to even hostile sources, that these were the claims. Even though these accounts are mockery, they further confirm the historicity of Jesus. All of these point also to the historical reliability of the accounts in the Bible. Even if they are neutral sources, mockeries, but the name is mentioned, time is mentioned, the events were mentioned.
Another fantastic one is the darkness evidence. In the book of Matthew, right, when Jesus was crucified, the Bible talks about darkness that happened around 12 to 3. You see that? And for so many people, they're like, it's fiction, it didn't really happen, until we began to see documents, extra biblical sources mentioning a darkness around 33 AD. People began to argue that it's the eclipse, right? The greatest eclipse in the world, earthquakes around 33 AD.
The same time frame. Crucifixion.
Yes. So we have that by Phlegon of Tralles. It says, in the time of Tiberius, there was a great eclipse of the sun and earthquakes, but an eclipse cannot happen during Passover, because during Passover is during the full moon. So there was an inexplainable darkness that we just can't uncover.
Further evidence for the events that the Bible mentioned. An earthquake happened. There's darkness after Christ died.
And then Julius Africanus was trying to respond back to tell us that this was not an eclipse, because eclipse does not happen during a Passover. The Talmud, which described Jesus' miracle as sorcery. Sanhedrin 43a, execution of Yeshua, they call him Yeshu. So on the eve of Passover, they hanged Yeshu, and a herald went out before him for 40 days. He practiced sorcery and enticed Israel. We have other sources, which we would not mention. Many.
We would discuss all of this in the conclusion when we're wrapping up. What are the implications of all of these evidences? So can we go to some of the archaeological pointers to some of the times?
Yes, archaeological confirmations. We spoke about the fact that archaeology helps, it's not fail-proof, but it helps us to build our confidence that, yes, the people we're mentioning interacted with real rulers of that time who existed. We can find the coins of rulers, these politicians, in real places within that time period. God forbid Jesus was born in Bethlehem, or we are seeing Nazareth, we are seeing the Sea of Galilee, only for us to research and realize that Galilee did not come to exist until the 3rd or 4th century. It becomes a problem.
So it means that if books or the authors or the biographies of Jesus claim that Jesus was born in Nazareth 4th century, and we eventually find that Nazareth did not exist until the 50th
Yeah.
century,
Yeah.
hypothetically speaking, there is a problem. But when we're able to find archaeological evidences pointing to these places
Yeah.
within these times that the Bible mentioned, it
Yeah.
goes ahead to further confirm, the
Yes.
claims.
Yeah, so let's look at the New Testament archaeological confirmations. We're able to confirm that Pontius Pilate existed. We found an inscription, Pontius Pilate. We're able to confirm that the pool of Bethesda exists. The pool mentioned in John 5, where the man paralyzed for 38 years, that exists. The pool of Siloam, where Jesus healed the man who was born blind, exists.
Mm-hmm.
Nazareth exists. Bethlehem exists. We found the heel bone of a crucified man called Yehohanan. It just also alludes to the fact that crucifixion existed, the way that the Bible described that his hands and his feet were pierced. That
This is not to say that those were the hands and feet of Jesus
no,
found.
no.
It was just evidence to the
Yes.
fact that crucifixion
Existed.
was a common thing
This is another
done by
man.
the Romans
Yes.
within the time of
Yes,
Jesus.
and this was found in Judea where Jesus was actually, tried and all of that. And then we also found the ossuary of Caiaphas the high priest, who was one of the people in Jesus's trial. So ossuary is like a bone box that consists of the bone, and so we're able to find, his name inscripted on it. So we're able to know that he also
existed. So the
existed.
Bible is making
Right.
references to these people that we had not even found as at when the Bible, like now we are just finding their historical evidences. We're just
Yeah.
finding through archaeology their
Yeah.
remains. We're
Yeah.
able to see that the Bible mentioned Caiaphas, the high priest. The
Yes.
Bible mentioned these people. And now we're finding the remains of these people. Goes further to
Yes.
confirm.
And Pontius Pilate's inscription as well. And then we also have other things like the Sea of Galilee. They're able to find boats today that date to the 1st century. The sea that Peter walked on, that they said there was a great storm. Oh my goodness. If you go there, the people that fish there say that the storms there are very, very terrible. You don't fish to a certain point because it can really get really, really bad. And so the way Peter was scared, he reached to be afraid. But Jesus said to him, "Oh,
Do
you
not
of
be
little
afraid."
faith." First of all, say, "Oh, you of little faith." Like, to tell them that you have a valid reason to be afraid, but don't be afraid. So you
Yeah.
too, I don't know why we're saying this.
Don't be afraid.
Don't be afraid. Jesus got you.
Period.
Walk on water. Walk on water.
Hallelujah, somebody.
All right. We also have evidence of Tiberius Caesar. We have for the second temple, some of the walls are remaining. We have of Golgotha, the Garden of Gethsemane, Bethlehem, Nazareth, Jerusalem. And there was a claim that Nazareth did not exist in the 1st century. There were so many debates about Nazareth as well, until they found that, yes, it's a small village that exists. So many of these things that we're seeing that exist earlier, there were many debates that this is just a myth, it's a sham, it doesn't exist, until archaeology came to confirm that these geographical locations actually existed.
Before we go into our own perspective on the evidences that we just shared, and this is not all, this is just a few of the evidences that we have for Jesus, it's important for us to know and for us to let our viewers know that it is not a historically debated fact that Jesus Christ of Nazareth was an actual historical figure. Atheists, people hostile to Christianity, and I'm not just talking about people in the ancient world, I'm talking about people today. It is generally agreed upon that Jesus Christ, was a person who existed in the 1st century, agreed historically by major historians, and
Yeah.
most of them, that Jesus Christ was crucified, that Jesus Christ died, that his disciples claimed to have seen him after he died and said that he resurrected. The bone of contention is not whether he died or whether he claimed to have been seen after his death. The bone of contention is what to do about Jesus. That he wasn't an historical figure, that he didn't exist, that he's just a made up person, is not historically accurate.
Jesus Christ's crucifixion under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius Caesar is one of the most attested, it is the best attested fact in
all of ancient history.
antiquity. So when people come up and say it was not crucified, it appeared to be so.
it
off
becomes
putting,
highly historically
concerning.
illogical, because
Yes.
that claim alone, it refutes all of ancient history.
Thank
The
you.
question an historian would have for you when you claim Jesus wasn't crucified is, where is the evidence? And
Very
there's no
good.
evidence for that.
Yes.
But there is evidence that he
That he
was
was
actually
crucified, even by
crucified.
hostile people that did not care for him, that didn't believe he was God. So his crucifixion is one of the best. We repeat that over and over again.
Best
Best
attested
attested
facts.
fact in ancient. Nobody debates that Jesus was real. He walked. He's not a myth. Jesus of Nazareth is not a myth or a legend that was developed over time. And the claims about who Jesus was, what he did, came in very, very early, too early to have been corrupted, too early to have been exaggerated or to have been developed into a legend. We're talking about months to at least 60 years after his crucifixion. And today we still have surviving manuscripts that date back to the first century of Jesus Christ. The time gap between the original writings and the copies that we have till today is quite early compared to others. For people like Plato, we don't argue about Plato. Plato is the father of philosophy. His manuscripts, the earliest surviving manuscripts came in 1,200 years later. Those are the earliest surviving manuscripts. For Caesar, 1,000 years. For Alexander the Great, 900 years. For Jesus, it still dates back to the first century. That is significantly early for ancient world. So if you deny the existence of Jesus,
It means that every other ancient figure is a lie.
Yes.
Because Jesus, there's more evidence for Jesus than there is for Plato, than for Socrates, than for Julius Caesar.
So if Tacitus even wrote about him.
So if we're saying that Jesus
yeah,
did not exist, we're saying that ancient history is a lie.
and
that
you
all of
ancient history.
the figures in ancient history, they're
Yes,
lies.
yes.
That they are myths or fables or made up. So it's safe to say that Jesus is the most attested person in ancient history.
Based on the multiple manuscripts that we have, based on their voracity, the way they spread across, making it so difficult to have been controlled. Also based on the sources that we have, the numerous multiple independent sources that we have, based on the geographical and archaeological confirmations that we have.
And most importantly, the most powerful, based on eyewitness account. Eyewitness testimony is the most powerful testimony even today. One of the most,
Yeah.
A video is kind of like an eyewitness testimony because you were practically recorded doing it. It's because the video then becomes the eyewitness. You understand? But in the ancient world, we did not have video cameras, but we had people who witnessed this.
Yeah.
And we're not just saying one person witnessed this and said it, two people witnessed this and said it. We're saying a lot of people, hostile, neutral, believers, Christians, said it, that Jesus was a person. So contrary to popular belief that, Christians think Jesus was a person. No. Atheists know Jesus was a person. Historians know Jesus was a person that walked on the earth. Hostile sources, people who tortured early believers, knew and did not debate that Jesus Christ was a real person.
And compared to other ancient, works, the New Testament was well preserved, very well preserved. It's quite a lot compared to others. But for someone of the social status and caliber of Jesus Christ, it's very unusual to find this much evidence for someone of Jesus's social status.
You don't find writings about a common carpenter.
Yes, you find more evidence for people who were emperors, kings, powerful, rich. In fact, mostly kings, high priests, like you have for Caiaphas, like you have for Herod, Tiberius, like you have for Julius Caesar. But Jesus was just a carpenter. So when you have this kind of voluminous number, we have over 5,000 of Greek manuscripts alone. It's enormous.
So it goes on to say that you cannot ignore the evidence. And I think we'll end with that today. And I think it's so important for us as individuals. If you're a Christian, this should strengthen your faith. And if you're in the middle or you're not a Christian, this should make you decide to really, let me figure this out. Let me look into this. Because the evidence is overwhelming, too overwhelming to ignore. And like C.S. Lewis said, Christianity, if false, is of no importance. But if it is true, It can be anything, but unimportant. So if you're an atheist or you belong to whatever religion it is, this is a call for you to really research what you believe. This is a call for you to really dig deep and look into
Yes.
what you believe. Because
Yes.
if there's a religion claiming that if you do not believe in this person, you will be condemned to eternal damnation, it is worth looking at. It is worth investigating, and you have to come to a stance that you'll be willing to bet your life on.
Yeah.
Because this is not a joke. It is not a joke. And we're not saying that while there is a place for faith, there is evidence that can help you
Yes,
find your way
reasonable
to faith.
evidence.
There is
Yes.
reasonable
Yes.
evidence. So make sure you do your research. Make sure
Yes.
you look into all that we have said today. Make sure you do your
You
research on
examine.
what you strongly believe in, and make sure you are willing to
Yes.
bet your life
Yes.
on it.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for you to know what to do with doubt. Doubt in itself is not a bus stop. Doubt in itself is not a problem. It's a seed of curiosity that you should build upon. So don't just have doubts and sit down. Do not just draw up conclusions based on doubt. Do your investigation and go from doubt to thorough conclusion. Look into all these evidences that we have mentioned. Do your research. Come to a conclusion. And I think it's very important to understand, like we have said already, the process it should take you to come to a conclusion. Don't just find a random document on the internet and say, oh, because of this document, I no longer believe. No. Go through thorough process of investigation and come to a conclusion that you can bet your life on.
I'm in Africa. We are Africans. In Africa, you don't show evidence by words, by mouth. You show evidence by power. We are Africans. So I know that for people in diaspora watching, you might need a lot of intellectual debates. In Africa, it's like you see people like, I didn't have a womb. Doctors told me I couldn't carry a child. My womb was literally removed. Now I have a womb. I can carry a child. Or you hear them say, one of our doctors told us of a client. She had this ectopic pregnancy twice. And so our fallopian tubes were removed. If you don't have a fallopian tube, you can't have a child. So she came and said she was sick. They thought it was malaria, but she was pregnant. Jesus healed her. Here in Africa, you show workings by evidence and power. I think to a large extent, we just know that we know that we know because we've seen too many supernatural events, too good to be true.
Yeah,
And then when you go through oppression by satanic oppression, you just know that life is spiritual and you see a need for God. But we're now in a generation that we see a need to have intellectual conversations, to know that your faith is not just grounded on the supernatural alone, but on logical, reasonable.
evidence.
Jesus is not a myth. He's not a God that is made by the works of men. He's a real person. He said what he said.
Made audacious claims.
He made audacious claims.
Did what he said he would do.
And because he resurrected, we know that everything he said was true. If Jesus did not resurrect, our faith is a lie, like Paul said. But because he resurrected, we know that our faith is true.
We do not really debate the existence of a supernatural realm in Africa because a lot of us grew up in communities where you had seen things happen.
Yeah.
Even
if you don't believe in Jesus Christ, you've seen people do things, supernatural things, in scary ways to other people.
So this is just a call for you to, really look into all these evidences that we have mentioned. Do your research.
Yes, so we're urging you and we're encouraging you to do your own due diligence. Examine the evidence for yourself. We've had many, C.S. Lewis was an atheist.
Yeah.
And he went through the evidence and he became a Christian. Lee Strobel was a skeptic, an agnostic. He and his wife, he went through the evidence to disprove his wife that this thing you're believing is a lie. And then he got converted. He used a journalistic, legal approach for the evidence of Jesus Christ. And you can also study his book, Strobel. You could look at that. You could also look at Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. You could look at, we're recommending books and resources to you because, like we said, sources matter.
Yes.
You could also go to Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Borkham. You could also go to read Gary Habermas, The Historical Jesus. Please examine the evidence for yourself. Do more research. Remember, sources matter. Don't believe in forgeries. That will be the most pain. If you want to believe in something that you can bet your life on, you want to ensure you have evidence for that.
And like I said, and like we both said, make sure your conclusion is one that you're willing to bet your life on. So thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Reveal Jesus podcast. We hope you had a good time. We hope you learned a lot.
There is so much the evidence for Jesus. Maybe we'll keep doing several parts. We can come at this and do this again, but this is what we have for you today.
And in the next episode, we'll be looking at,
is the Bible corrupt? Is the New Testament corrupt? Is it a pope that selected and cherry-picked the Bible, the books in the New Testament? Who wrote what? We're going to look into all of that. So ensure that you like, subscribe, and turn on your notification bell so you do not miss out on our subsequent videos. We'll take a few seconds and do that right now. If you enjoy this, and like, so that the algorithm pushes this to more people to watch and be saved.
Thank you so much for watching this video. We will see you again next time.